Not only in terms of thinking about independence and Brexit, but in other things, Scotland has gone a different way from the rest of Great Britain. So I'm here to talk to you about some differences in the Scottish legislation, to give you some insights into how things could be different in a TB-free world. Okay. So Scotland was declared officially TB-free in 2009. The particulars of the legislation aren't important for now, except to say that it requires that you essentially have almost no herds with TB being declared in them, so no officially TB-free withdrawal herds, except for a very small percentage. Now that very small percentage is an important point. It is not zero, okay? It is very, very low. All right. Now, the consequence of being declared officially TB-free is that Scotland has been able to change its surveillance approach. In particular, reduce the amount of testing with the aim of simply not testing the things for which testing has no point. There's an awful lot of herds, and this is going to be true in England as well, which do a lot of TB testing for no purpose. Okay, so as to support this development of a risk-based surveillance approach for looking at TB in Scotland, we in Glasgow developed a risk-based surveillance model. This composes of two parts. First of all is an assessment of the statistical risk associated with every single farm in Scotland of it having a TB breakdown. Okay, so having reactors confirmed on that herd. Once you have that statistical model, you then have an estimate of the probability of freedom from infection for every single herd, which is the input to a simulation model that can look at variations in testing. Now, as you've probably already heard, there's an enormous amount of data associated with TB in Britain. So we have information about where herds are, the amount of movements that they have, the kinds of herds they are, and all those different factors when you're looking at TB herds versus non-TB herds. And this, the details of this aren't important, except to say there's a lot of information there that allows you to discriminate quite nicely between herds which have a high risk of TB and herds that do not. Okay, so as we churn through the statistical model, and again, this is not the audience for giving you details about that, we came up with three major risk factors. Now, the thing to keep in mind about this is what we're trying to achieve is a balance between precision on the one hand and viability as a legislative tool. Okay, so what you want are simple rules for how to decide whether a herd is likely to be low risk or not. And so we ended up with three major risk factors. Number one is herd size, okay, with herds that are with over 100 animals being about 7 times more likely to have a breakdown compared to herds that had 0 to 10 animals. Buying in both Irish imports and imports from high-risk areas in England and Wales are also extremely important. In fact, they are the most important thing in this context. Difference of herds types have a small difference in the underlying model in terms of what their underlying business practice is, but actually you capture most of the information in this. Okay, so we can put those statistical risks into our determine a probability of freedom of infection according to that model, and then we can ask the question is, what happens if we change the testing rates? So for example, what if we decide not to test some herds at all? What if we decide to test some herds more frequently, for example? And the object of this particular exercise was to do two things, as I mentioned before, to stop testing low-risk herds, preferably at all, and rely on abattoir surveillance to pick up any TB that might be there, but at the same time to maintain the original detection rates. Okay? So not to lose. So it's a win-win situation in that case, if we can manage it. So I mentioned before that we put these statistical risks into a simulation model which evaluates different testing policies. Now, for the purposes of this exercise here, the simulation model we had was very, very simple and had some very important assumptions which are not bad when you're looking at low incidence areas, but are obviously poor for high incidence areas. Okay. So the first thing is that the skin test and the abattoir surveillance sensitivity and specificity are based purely on prior data. Okay. So basically any information we had on how good they were is what went into the model. The model does not estimate those things directly. Second, every single test for every single animal has the same probability of detecting disease if it is infected. And what I mean by that is simply if you have a cow that's infected with TB and you had a 50% chance of testing it once and detecting disease, you would, if you tested again, also have a 50% chance. And therefore, multiple tests would eventually catch the disease in that animal. We assume that every single cow responds to tests in the same way, so we know that host susceptibility is a potential factor here. It does vary, but we assumed every single cow is the same, and that there are no age-dependent effects, okay, with some hints that younger cattle test differently, say, than older cattle, but we didn't take that into account here. One of the most important assumptions is the last one. The assumption is that additional time to detection will make no difference in terms of detecting disease in a herd. Okay? Now, what that implies is that the amount of transmission in the herds is expected to be reasonably low. Now, we know on average that is likely to be true. We also know in specific cases it is definitely not true. And I'll get back to that a little bit later. Okay, so if you make those assumptions in our simulation model, and I'm only going to highlight two particular examples here. If we, now is this going to give me, yes it is, a laser pointer. If we consider the current test breeding regime versus something that does something quite similar, okay, in terms of the fitted number of detected infections, the number of infections that are not found, and the number of false positives that you might get, you can get pretty much the same result by testing only about just over 70% of the herds in the country. So reducing your testing by quite a considerable amount. So what is the underlying criteria for being test exempt? Basically, there's two different pathways. Pathway number one, I'm going to start with at the bottom, is that if you send more than 40% of your animals to slaughter, then you don't have to be tested. Okay, so there's a couple of reasons for that, all right? Reason number one, if you're sending a lot of animals to slaughter, chances are that the place where disease is going to be detected is going to be at the slaughterhouse and not through the skin test. Okay? I think you might have already heard about how the skin test is not a particularly good test for detecting TB. It works, but it's not great. Okay? That also has a secondary effect, which is if you're sending most of your animals to slaughter, okay, then what's happening then is you're not sending them on to other farms. And if you're not sending them on to other farms, even if you have a breakdown, even if you have reactors, you pose a low risk to other farmers. And that's absolutely crucial, because we don't want to have happen is to have reduced testing resulting in larger outbreaks in cattle because of cattle. The second pathway basically follows one of two directions. Either you send more than 25% of your animals to slaughter and have a very small herd. Remember, small herds are not a huge risk. Or you're at low risk because you have very few animals coming from high-risk areas. Okay, and that's both Ireland and England and Wales. Okay? Now, up until January 1st of this year, the herd size of 20 or less was exempt. Now it's herd sizes of 50 or less, which is one indication that this approach is actually working in Scotland. We're not getting big outbreaks. Okay, so we did the analysis in 2011. It was accepted in 2012. As I said before, about 30% of Scottish herds are exempt from testing, and the net savings to government and farmers is about £250,000 per year. So a fairly substantial chunk of money, nothing like the cost to control it in England and Wales, of course, but still money that you would be much happier putting towards something else. It does have additional secondary effects. It lessens the stress on cattle and means the farmers don't have to bring their animals in for testing every 4 years. Okay. Now, of course, if you take this approach, you don't test every single herd, you could get it wrong. Sometimes you'll miss something. And what that means, the disease will stay in longer. So that can be bad. Okay, so this was before we implemented this surveillance policy. It was one of the things we were aware at the time. There was an outbreak in a herd in Ballincrief of about 60 reactors with 20 plus condemned animals, so 20 plus with multiple lesions. Just an indication that you do have to be very wary about these events occurring. Now, it was a largely closed herd. There wasn't any onward risk really at the time, but nevertheless, vigilance is required. Okay? And what I mean by that are essentially two things. There's traditional veterinary surveillance. There's vets going out in farms and doing investigations, checking outbreaks, looking for suspicious outcomes. From the more research point of view, the Center of Expertise in Animal Disease Outbreaks is a multi-institutional organization that I and others here actually are part of. At Biomathematics and Statistics of Scotland, they're looking at forensic looks at outbreaks to determine whether they can determine the sources of risks for individual herds. In Glasgow, we're monitoring the year-on-year TB incidence to determine if there are any unusual spikes in the numbers. And we're also looking at whole genome sequencing, potentially, okay, looking for the potential signatures for local problems. Because one of the issues which everybody is very wary of is the potential for local wildlife problems to potentially result from having a big cattle problem. And I mentioned in particular that if you look at the signature in other places, in Northern Ireland, in the southwest of England, there's a very strong spatial signature to the phylogeny. So there's something about spatial distance which really matters there, which is not likely to be true in Scotland. Okay. So what about England? So that's Scotland. Glenn, how much time do we got?
You have about 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, that's not too bad. So a good part of England is about to become TB free, which means you can do the same kind of thing for the low-risk areas in England. And so the risk models for England and Scotland are slightly different, but they tell you more or less the same things. And again, you see that there's evidence that you could actually get similar identification rates if you test about 70, so slightly more herds, because the risk in England is higher, but still potential for substantial savings to be had at this point. I think an important point to note over here is that if I look at the prediction of herds under the Scottish model and the English model, so this is what a predicted herd infection rate would be, probability would be in England, this would be if it's in Scotland. It's actually pretty much the same for most herds, but there's a certain subset of herds for which the risk in England is substantially higher. And this suggests that the risk models could be refined to figure out better who these particular herds are, which is something we're working on right now, actually. Yeah. Okay, just to finish off, as I said before, the model we have is very, very crude. There's a large big data type simulation project to use the data in a much more sophisticated way, take all the information we had, use cloud computing resources to fit the model. This is every single cow in Britain moving over the past 10 years. And the end result is we can do a lot of things with this. So this was commissioned by DEFRA. But we can do a lot of things with it. But one of the things we can do is refine our risk-based surveillance models across all of GB, including potentially high-risk areas as well, in a much better way. So in summary, Scotland, in my view, certainly is a BTB success story. Okay, the disease is largely eliminated. We managed to save a lot of money. You could potentially also save a lot of money in England as well, once officially TB-free status is achieved. But as I said before, this surveillance is really important. Just because you don't have it now doesn't mean you're not going to have it in the future, and you've got to be wary of that at all times. So I'm going to thank the various people who are involved in the project, the Scottish government and DEFRA, not just for their funding, actually. We usually put in government for funding, but I think in both cases we've had really good engagement in terms of what these models could be and what we could do to refine them. So I'm going to thank them as people and not just as sources of money in this case. And thank you very much.